Not backstage, not in the audience, just slightly out of frame. Claire Bennett stood beneath the blue-white lights of the rehearsal hall, one hand still holding the event card she had been given at check-in, and looked toward the front row, where the stage manager was quietly rearranging name placards for the final run-through. Her husband's name was centered. The chairman's name was beside it. The donor couple's seats had been moved closer to the aisle, and the place reserved for Claire, the woman who had designed the initiative, negotiated the partnerships, and carried the entire civic project through 18 months of invisible crisis, had been shifted 3 seats down, just far enough away that the camera line would no longer naturally catch. At first, she thought it was a staging adjustment, a lighting issue, a last-minute production change, one of those harmless event decisions that mean nothing until they mean everything. Then she heard the woman from communications say it softly to the floor director, not knowing Claire was close enough to hear. "We just need the frame to tell the cleaner's story." Claire didn't move. Because sometimes betrayal does not arrive as insult. Sometimes it arrives as editing. By the following morning, the man they planned to center in that story would no longer be able to represent the initiative publicly. The board would discover that image control becomes fragile the moment truth comes with timestamps, approvals, and money trails. And Claire, who had spent years being praised as brilliant, graceful, and indispensable, would finally understand that indispensable is one of the most dangerous compliments in the world, when it is coming from people who have already decided you are also disposable. Before I tell you how a woman spent 8 years building a national education initiative only to realize they were preparing to crop her out of the victory and hand her the collapse if anything went wrong, stay with me. Because this story is not really about an award ceremony. It is about what happens when the people closest to you stop asking what is true and start asking what looks cleaner without you in the picture. For most of her adult life, Claire Bennett had been described the way powerful institutions like to describe women whose work they rely on without wanting to fully rearrange the hierarchy around them. Sharp, steady, elegant under pressure, a genius at making difficult things look easy. That last one had followed her for years. She makes difficult things look easy. It sounded like admiration, and maybe, in the mouths of strangers, it was. But inside the world Claire had helped build, the phrase carried another meaning too. She handles the complexity, and we keep the glory polished. The Mercer Learning Initiative, later renamed the Bennett Rhodes Civic Futures Program after a donor expansion and a marriage that looked more balanced from the outside than it had ever truly been, had not begun as success. When Claire first joined, it was half ambition, half branding exercise. Glossy decks, emotional language, political enthusiasm, and very little infrastructure strong enough to survive scale. She was the one who changed that. She wrote the partnership framework that made the first city rollout possible. She negotiated the data protection language that kept the program from being devoured by public criticism during its pilot year. She rebuilt the donor sequence after an embarrassing pledge gap nearly exposed how much of the initiative had been running on image and improvisation. She turned a vanity-adjacent project into an institution with enough substance to outlive the people who wanted to stand in front of it. And all the while, Daniel Rhodes, her husband, public co-chair, media favorite, beloved panel speaker, learned how to stand beside her work, until eventually standing beside it became standing in front of it. Daniel had not begun as a villain. That was part of Claire's problem, and later, part of her grief. He had once seemed relieved by her mind, not threatened, not competitive, relieved. He used to say she brought order to rooms full of expensive nonsense, used to text her after board dinners and ask, "What did you really think?" used to correct people when they simplified her role in the early years. At the beginning, he loved her clarity because it made him feel less scattered, less performative, more worthy of the future he wanted. But admiration changes in certain people once they realize the person they love is not merely helping them succeed. She is quietly making them possible. And if they do not have enough humility to love that truth, they begin managing it instead. Daniel learned, year by year, how to absorb what Claire created without ever saying the exact lie out loud. He did not need to. Rooms full of money, politics, and legacy do much of that work for you if you let them. A journalist would praise his long-view discipline, using language Claire had drafted in his remarks the night before. A donor would thank him for stabilizing the initiative after a crisis Claire had personally corrected over 72 sleepless hours. A governor's aide would speak about Daniel's rare ability to combine vision and operational realism, while Claire sat 4 feet away, holding the binder that contained the actual operational realism. Every incident could be explained. That was the trap. Not one dramatic theft, 1,000 elegant softenings. At first, Claire corrected things privately, then gently, then less often. Daniel always met those conversations with the same exhausted intimacy that so often marks the beginning of a woman's disappearance. You know how these events work. It wasn't deliberate. Not every moment needs a correction. You matter more than the optics. Why let public language cheapen what we actually know is true? What we actually know is true. That phrase stayed with her, because in many relationships, the most lonely place in the world is the gap between private acknowledgement and public protection. Daniel knew. That was never really the question. The question was whether he loved her enough to let truth cost him something in real time. Over time, his answer became clearer. Not enough. The person who understood that shift earliest was not Claire. It was his mother. Eleanor Rhodes had spent decades moving through institutions with the serene confidence of a woman who understood that the cleanest violence is social, not emotional. She rarely said anything obviously cruel. She didn't have to. She knew how to make diminishment sound like discernment. Claire has such extraordinary execution energy, she once said at a foundation dinner, smiling over candlelight and linen as if she were offering praise that ought to satisfy everyone in the room. Daniel gives the initiative its moral language, but Claire is the one who makes all the moving pieces land. People nodded. Someone called that a perfect partnership. Claire smiled too, but the sentence followed her home. Because what Eleanor had done, gently, beautifully, effectively, was define Daniel as meaning and Claire as mechanism. He was the voice. She was the machinery. And in rooms where legacy matters more than fairness, the person cast as machinery almost always ends up being treated as replaceable the moment the machine looks stable enough to run without visible repair. The crisis that changed everything arrived 6 months before the awards ceremony. An internal audit found serious discrepancies between how the initiative's national expansion had been sold to 2 donor blocks and how the rollout risk had actually been structured. The issue is fixable, but only if addressed honestly and fast. If handled badly, it could trigger regulatory review, donor withdrawal, and a cascade of reputation damage across every public face attached to the initiative. Daniel panicked privately. The board hardened publicly. Eleanor immediately began discussing message containment. Claire did what she always did. She built a bridge. She pulled the internal flags, mapped the approval chain, found the language that could preserve donor trust without creating legal self-destruction, rebuilt the public sequence, drafted the internal contingency notes. And because she understood institutions better than the people inheriting them, she also created a dormant review mechanism, one that would automatically reopen governance responsibility if material public misrepresentation later separated credit, authority, or blame from the real decision chain. She didn't do it because she planned to use it. She did it because she had already spent too many years watching polished people confuse narrative control with reality. The mechanism was boring enough to be ignored, technical enough to be signed, quiet enough to stay alive. And that was precisely why it mattered. Months later, when the initiative was finally receiving a major national civic leadership award, everyone acted as if the storm had passed. Publicly, the expansion looked like a triumph. The rollout had held. The partnerships were stable. The donors were smiling again. But Claire knew what the institution truly rested on: documentation, correction, containment, and her willingness to keep doing the invisible labor that prevented other people's overconfidence from becoming expensive. That was why the rehearsal cut deeper than it should have. Because the problem was not merely that they were moving her seat, it was that she understood the instinct beneath it. Someone had decided the final story would play better if the visual center of gravity shifted away from the woman whose fingerprints were too deeply embedded in the mechanics. Cleaner's story. That phrase stayed in her body all through rehearsal. Then it got worse. 40 minutes later, in a side corridor outside the green room, Claire heard Daniel speaking with Eleanor and the head of communications. The door wasn't fully closed. No one expected her to be there. If the panel asks about the audit period, the communications director said, we keep it high level. Daniel speaks to leadership pressure, institutional transition, and lessons learned. And Claire? Eleanor asked. A beat of silence. Then, Daniel said the sentence Claire would remember long after she forgot what anyone was wearing that night. She understands the difference between contribution and positioning. Claire did not blink, did not step back, did not make a sound. People often imagine the end of love as a dramatic snap, a shattered glass, a door, a scream. But sometimes it is only a sentence spoken in a voice so calm it reveals the betrayal had already been made livable long before it was spoken aloud. Contribution and positioning. That was how he had come to see her, not as partner, not as co-architect, not as the woman whose mind had carried years of institutional weight, as contribution, useful, substantial, necessary even, but not central. That night, Claire did not confront him. She went home, changed out of the dress everyone had praised, sat in the library with her laptop open to a private archive no one else knew she maintained, and began preserving the full truth. Every draft, every flagged risk, every delayed approval, every donor warning, every speech revision where Daniel's polished moral language had first existed in Claire's tracked changes. Every decision trail showing where authority had truly lived and how carefully public narrative had been massaged to keep that reality aesthetically distant from the faces meant to represent it. The more she gathered, the calmer she became. Pain often feels chaotic only until it becomes documented. Once it becomes pattern, it stops asking for interpretation. It asks for a decision. By dawn, Claire had made hers. She would not interrupt the ceremony. She would not publicly humiliate him. She would not become the spectacle their world would instantly use to discredit the substance beneath her anger. She would let the story proceed. And then, she would correct the frame. The award ceremony the next night was exactly what people like Eleanor Rhodes believe American legitimacy should look like. A theater restored with donor money, a stage washed in blue-white civic seriousness, politicians in the front row, education journalists along the aisle, camera crews trained carefully on the people most useful to the mythology. Claire wore black, simple, precise, almost severe. Daniel wore confidence well enough that the room mistook it for integrity. He took the stage, told the story beautifully, not falsely in the simple sense. That would have been easier to resist. He did what men like him always do when they have learned how to metabolize a woman's labor into their own public fluency. He told a story that was emotionally true enough to feel moral while still leaving the architecture of reality intact, only in the places that benefited him. He thanked the board, the city partners, the school leaders, the donor families, his mother, the future. He did not name the person who had saved the initiative when it should have died. He did not say Claire. And suddenly, the seat shift from rehearsal made perfect sense. The frame had already been prepared. Claire waited until the applause peaked. Then she checked her phone. At that exact moment, the review package she had triggered 12 hours earlier reached the board audit chair, lead donor council, and the Civic Oversight Committee attached to the initiative's federal grant track. By the time Daniel stepped off stage, 3 people who mattered more than applause were already reading the truth. The reversal did not happen through shouting. That was never Claire's style. It happened through timing. A board member pulled Daniel aside before the press line. Council intercepted the communications director.
A donor representative asked why the official remarks materially separated leadership credit from documented operational authority during the audited recovery window.
Then, the Oversight Committee requested immediate clarification on the discrepancy between public representation and internal governance records. The temperature changed, not emotionally, structurally. By the time the reception began, Daniel had been quietly removed from the post-award press briefing. The board froze all external messaging pending internal review. And Eleanor, who had spent years treating narrative management like a form of aristocratic intelligence, was left standing in a corridor with no room left to organize the story socially before the documents organized it for her. Claire didn't chase anyone. She didn't need to. The truth was moving now. Daniel found her near the side balcony, away from the cameras. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, not yet. It was worse. It was frightened. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the only sentence that mattered. "I stopped letting you edit me out of what I built." He stared at her as if the line were crueler than it was. But reality sounds cruel when someone has lived too long inside its softened version. "You could have talked to me," he said. Claire almost smiled. "I did," she said quietly. "You just preferred me in draft form." He had no answer to that, because the final truth in a relationship is rarely brand new. It is simply the first truth, no longer rearranged to protect the person who refused to hear it sooner. The board review that followed was devastating in the way elegant institutions hate most. No scandal theatrics, no viral meltdown, no one dragged from a podium, just records, approvals, revision history, decision chains, authorship trails, the cold professionalism of documentation refusing to continue serving a lie. Daniel lost public-facing authority over the initiative pending extended review. Eleanor lost her grip on messaging. The board was forced to issue corrected leadership language. And the award night everyone had planned as a clean public consecration became instead the evening the institution was forced to admit who had actually kept it alive. But Claire's victory was not fame, not revenge, not even recognition in the shallow sense. It was freedom from a smaller, sadder arrangement she had tolerated too long. For years, she had mistaken being deeply relied on for being deeply loved. She had confused private gratitude with public courage. She had treated composure as nobility long past the point where it was simply making her easier to erase beautifully. That changed now. She did not become harder. She became exact. She stopped translating herself into softer language so other people could keep feeling larger than the work beneath them. She stopped believing dignity arrives after somebody important finally says your name. She stopped helping people tell cleaner stories at the cost of her own reality. And maybe that is what stories like this are really about. Not the moment the wrong person loses the microphone, but the moment the right person stops protecting the edit. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what hurts more in the end? Being openly blamed, or realizing someone you loved had already decided the cleaner story was the one without you at the center of it? Some betrayals don't begin with cruelty. They begin with editing. I'll see you in the next story.